My name is Koley Freeman. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Kansas State University with Dr. Alice Boyle, who you heard from, I think, a couple weeks ago now. She talked to you about migration. Today, I'm going to be talking about some of the work that I'm doing, which involves a very small grassland bird that lives out on the prairie that's nearby town, and how it's coping with weather. So, this photo of a meadowlark, Dr. Alice Boyle actually showed you several weeks ago, but it represents the 3 billion birds that have been lost. Not unsurprising with how things are going in the world, with increased human interference, with climate change. We are seeing a disappearance of birds in massive, massive numbers. But it's not all doom and gloom for everybody. So if we look at a map of North America and we break it up into very general regions, we have areas like the tundra where there are no trees. We have the giant swath of boreal forest, and then we break up the U.S. by the eastern middle here, we have the grasslands. And we just happen to be right in the center of that. The birds in each of these regions are responding differently over time. For example, for the arid land birds, if we look at them over time, they're not really declining too much. So what this plot is showing is from the 70s to today, a decline of birds from 0 to about 600 million birds. So arid birds are doing relatively okay. Birds from the other regions are also doing okay. If we get to the boreal forest, we see a pretty massive decline. But if we look at the birds of the grasslands, the birds here in Kansas, they are by far doing the worst. So here we see a decline of over 600 million birds within the grassland region. So this is in part due to the conversion of grasslands into agricultural areas. So here's a photo here of a pristine short grassland. We also see this locally here with the tall grass prairies. If we take a look at this map, we see in the bright green where tall grass prairie used to be. But now only 5% of that tall grass prairie still exists. And a lot of it is still here in Kansas. So this conversion of habitat into less suitable habitat for these birds is one reason why these birds are declining. Another one, though, is the changing climate. So we live in a highly dynamic world, and over the past several hundred years, with increased human interference, we are seeing a warming climate. And this results in an increase in extreme weather events, an increase of fires in some areas, flooding in others. We see in the north an increase in blizzards. And here, locally, we see some more extreme storms. What does this changing climate mean for Kansas? At a local scale, we're going to be seeing higher temperatures over the coming years. That makes sense. The world is warming up. As a result of these higher temperatures, we're seeing more evaporation of water from the ground and from our waterways. And this leads to drier soils. And these drier soils have consequences. Not only is it going to impact the yield of all our crops, but it also has impacts on wildlife and how they can manage and deal with their changing habitat. With the drier soil and the higher temperatures, we're going to be seeing a decrease in summer rainfall. And that is not great for Kansas because about 85% of the precipitation that occurs throughout the year is during the summer. So not only are we going to have drier soil due to higher temperatures, but we're also going to have drier soil because overall we're going to get less rain. So what we're going to see is more and more days where there are no rain, so longer droughts. But at the same time, the storms are going to become more turbulent. So what we're going to see is instead of a nice drizzle of rain, we're going to be seeing rain coming down in downpours with lightning, thunder, higher chances of tornadoes. So while we're going to see a decrease in rainfall, we're going to see an increase in the severe weather events. And in combination with all these other factors, the drier soil, the more severe storms, the more downpours, we're going to see a much higher risk of floods. So overall, this is what we're going to be expecting for Kansas in the coming 50 or so years. Doesn't look too great with respect to the agricultural sector of Kansas, but we'll somehow be able to manage, or maybe we can start to reverse some of these things. So that's how that's going to impact humans, but let's move on and talk about how it's going to impact birds. Weather impacts birds and other wildlife through many different ways. So imagine putting yourself out as a bird, you're outside, all of a sudden you see this massive cloud come in. There are many different ways that you can respond to that coming storm. So, and then all of a sudden it's a giant thunderstorm that's come in. What are the different ways that it can cope? What it's basically going to be doing is altering its behavior to increase its chance of survival. And it can do that in several different ways. So they can do it by changing their diet. So if they were eating seeds, they could switch to something that's higher in calories, higher in fat, higher in protein, like caterpillars or grasshoppers in the short term. They could also hunker down. So a lot of the times during a storm, birds will seek shelter in shrubs, in trees, or like the grasshopper sparrow, they'll just go down in really dense patches of grass. And they can also choose to just get up and leave. So they could avoid the storm by leaving the area entirely. But this increase in survival often has a cost. So if they devote a lot of energy into surviving these extreme weather events, it means that they're devoting less time and energy into other components of their life, such as reproduction. So while they're going to try their best to increase their survival, at the same time that might lead to them having a decreased success reproductively. They can do this by abandoning their nests. So if the weather is so severe that the female cannot sit on her eggs or her nestlings any longer, she has to just leave and abandon them. That can happen. They might also invest less. So she might put less energy into the number of eggs she produces or the size of eggs she produces because she knows that there's a higher chance of losing them in certain areas. So this is how birds can respond behaviorally, but they can also respond physiologically. So you can imagine that if you are out in a storm for a long period of time, you might see some downstream effects on your condition. You might come out really, really wet and haggard and thin because it's very energetically costly to survive these storms. So if we take a look at this image right here, what I'm going to be showing you is how energy stores of these birds change in response to weather. In this nice fluffy yellow cloud color here are fat stores. So birds store a lot of their energy in fat, which they put along their flanks, up in their neck, and down through their body. But they also store energy within their musculature. So here I have this image of the muscles of their leg. And how they respond to these extreme weather events can be seen in how the birds are storing their energy within their musculature and within their fat. So following an extreme weather event, what we might see is the birds getting overall thinner. We could see that they depleted some of their fat stores. They could even, if the storm is long enough and extreme enough, they could even start to eat away at some of their musculature because they're starving. And they just need that much energy to keep surviving. But this is reversible. So following an extreme weather event, these birds could go out again and start foraging, start bulking up, start growing more of their muscles back, depositing more fat into their stores. So we can see birds that are slightly anemic or starved, they can reverse this if they're strong enough to go forward again. So we've talked about different ways that individuals can respond to weather, both at the physiological level and the behavioral level. But it's important to understand these connections because everything that happens at the individual level can scale up to impact populations. And this can happen through many different processes. So if a bird is stressed and there's an extreme weather event like a tornado or something that causes them to abandon their nest, they could alter how many offspring they have. And the number of births that are present or that happen can impact whether population grows or not. Storms can directly also impact the survival of the birds through death. So we could see the population shrink if we see a lot of mortality following a storm. And then with respect to avoiding the storm, we can also see birds move around between populations. So if a bird is faced with the obstacle of a storm and all they can do to survive is to leave the area entirely, we might see them emigrate from the population. And if there's storms in other areas, we might see birds immigrate into the population. So what I do is I study how birds at the individual level respond to storms. And as I continue in my postdoc, I'm going to be translating that into how birds at the population level respond. And I do this in using grasshopper sparrows. So some of you might have seen or heard grasshopper sparrows here. They are extremely elusive, so I completely understand if you haven't seen one before. But they are these little, small brown birds that basically just run throughout the grass, and every once in a while you can hear a male singing his nice grasshopper-like song. So they live in the grasslands. Here in Kansas, they really like the tall grass prairies, so you'll see quite a few of them out on Kanza. They are migratory, so currently right now they're down in Texas area, northern Mexico, before coming back up to start breeding in a couple months. And importantly, they nest on the ground. So they build their nests in little domed, grassy areas, which makes them super susceptible to flooding. So you can imagine if there's a downpour, there's a chance that a bunch of water could collect on the ground, leading to mortality events of offspring. So I hinted that they're migratory. If we take starting January, going all the way around, we're basically right now in the part where they're migrating. So these birds are short-distance migrants. They overwinter down in Texas and northern Mexico. But pretty soon, roughly April, they're going to be up here and out throughout the grasslands, and they are going to start breeding. And they can have several clutches throughout the year before they start migrating back down again. And then they overwinter. They don't often see snow, but I thought it would be a nice fit since people typically associate winter with snow, even though it's not very common down in Texas and Mexico. If we take a look at their range map, Here we have a map of North America. Down in the blue is where they currently are. This is their overwintering grounds. In the purple, we have areas where they're there year-round. And up in the top here, you can see where they come to breed. So in this pink salmony color is where they breed, and the star is where we are right now, and where I study the birds. So I study the birds at Konza Prairie. This study is considered a long-term study because it's been going for 10 years now, and it's run by Dr. Alice Boyle, who you heard from a couple years ago. And we study these birds because they are in trouble. Like many of the other grassland birds, we are seeing declines in their populations, and throughout their range, we've seen population declines of over 60%. So we're trying to figure out what's happening with these birds, how we can best mitigate some of the causes of their declines, and see if we can help them in the future. If you're unfamiliar with Konza, which you probably are not, but this is a map of Konza. It's broken up into a bunch of different watersheds that are experimentally treated. Half of them get grazing by bison or cattle, while the other half are ungrazed. And then we also have a fire regime where some watersheds are burned annually, every 2 years, every 4 years, every 20 years. So it's a really cool landscape that we are able to study these birds on, and it results in this nice mosaic of land. So here you can see this area was recently burned and is growing back, and then this area has a few more shrubs and denser foliage. It hasn't been burned as recently. And where we study the grasshopper sparrows is on for the most part, is on the 2-year burn plots. For some reason, they like those areas the best. And the reason for that is likely due to the vegetation structure. But that work is still happening with another PhD student. So not only is the whole landscape this nice mosaic of shrubs, some trees down in the valleys, and this nice tall grass prairie up on the uplands, but it also changes within a season. So here we have an area that was burned in the spring. You can see some nice purple trees there. The grass is nice and short. But by the time we get into the later summer, the grass is much taller, the forbs are much taller, it's a lot more dense. So these are the types of habitats that we would likely see the grasshopper sparrows in. So using these grasshopper sparrows, I was really interested in understanding how weather and extreme weather events, such as the storms, what role they have in grasshopper sparrow physiology. So I'm going to talk about what effect storms have on their energy stores and their overall condition. I was interested in what role weather plays in their reproduction, so whether or not they invest differently into their eggs depending on weather, and whether or not weather impacts their reproductive success, with the ultimate goal of figuring out what role weather plays in the actual growth of the population. So is this population slightly growing in response to these changes in weather, or is it going to be declining? So let's start things off with physiology. To look at the energy stores of these birds, what we have to do is we have to go out into the field, set up a bunch of mist nets. So here's a picture of a mist net blowing in the wind. And we basically need to catch these birds. So we lure the birds into nets using playback, and sometimes we use long sticks and kind of chase after them to get them into the net. Once we've captured them, we keep them in hand for about a 5 to 10 minute period, during which time we take measurements, we give them bands so that we can follow them throughout the rest of their lifetime. And we also put them through a machine called a quantitative magnetic resonance machine. And that sounds really, really daunting, but it's essentially this mini MRI machine where we put them in this tube before releasing them. And we put that tube into the machine, and it tells us how much water that bird is holding, how much fat that bird has, and its lean mass. And the lean mass is everything else but the fat. So that includes the organs, the musculature, the skeleton, everything else but the fat. So, if we look at this line as time, we capture the bird and we call that day 0. What we can then do is look back in time and see how past events impact that bird at day 0. In particular, we were looking at what happened in the week prior to capture. So one thing we did was look at how just the general temperature affected these birds. So I took the average temperature in the week leading up to capture to see how that affected the energy stores of these birds. And what I found was that the warmer temperatures, so if the temperature on average was warmer in the week leading up to capture, the birds had higher fat stores, and their lean mass was also higher. So this suggests that maybe these birds were able to forage a little bit more, or there was more food available for them to eat and put that energy into their fat stores and their lean mass. Whereas birds exposed to the cooler temperatures tended to be thinner, have less fat, and a lower lean mass. So that's the temperature side of things. I've talked a lot about extreme weather events. So what about storms? We did the same thing. Capture is day 0, and we wanted to see how a storm impacted their energy stores. But we only looked within the last 48 hours. So the 2 days leading up to capture, what effect does an extreme weather event defined by a ton of rain in a very short period of time due to the bird's physiology? And what I found was the exact opposite of temperature. So birds that experienced drier conditions tended to have the higher fat stores, and birds that experienced a storm in the 2 days leading up to capture had lower fat stores, suggesting that to survive that storm, they needed to use up some of that fat energy to keep them alive. Storms also here in Kansas sometimes come with tornadoes. So another person recently studied birds down in Oklahoma, and they had an extreme weather event or tornado go through their study area during the breeding season for these birds. And they unexpectedly found out that the storm actually had a massive effect on the developing young. So what they found was that they could figure out when this storm happened based on the feathers of these birds. So normal feather growth is basically a deposition of protein into the feathers. So just like we grow hair, they grow feathers. And if you go through a period of stress, sometimes your hair thins out during that time when you are growing your hair. The same thing happens in birds. So here we have an image of a normal rectress. This is a tail feather. So this one is nice and uniform. But if we compare that to these two rectrices, it's a little bit hard to see, but we see these periods within the feather growth where the width is a little narrower, there's less pigmentation, overall the feather is a little bit thinner, and overall weaker within this growth period and then this growth period. And what Ross et al. Found was that the nestlings that experienced this severe weather event while they were growing their tail ended up having a huge fault bar along their tail during that time when they were growing it. So what does this tell us? This tells us that storms not only affect the energy stores of these birds, but it also affects their overall condition. So these fault bars and feathers tell us that during that time when they were growing those feathers, they were either starved, so they were eating their own protein, basically consuming themselves to stay alive. It also tells us that these birds were stressed during that time, which is understandable if there's a massive tornado going through where you're trying to live. So I've shown you a couple of examples of how weather impacts the physiology of these grasshopper sparrows. Let's move into the reproductive side of things, looking at investment and nest failure. To do this sort of work, what we have to do is go out and find all the nests that we can. And this involves walking for hours throughout Kanza. And whenever we see a female flush off the ground, that's typically a sign that there is a nest nearby. And then you have to get on your hands and knees and look for the tiny, tiny, really elusive grass nest. Another way that we look for nests is we drag a rope between two people, and same sort of idea, as the rope will go over the grass, sometimes a female will flush up, so we can go look in that area. And we follow these birds as they're breeding throughout the entirety of their breeding season. So while the female is laying eggs, we keep track of how many eggs, the size of the eggs, and we follow them throughout the nesting period to see when they finally fledge or leave the nest, or whether or not they get predated by snakes or other larger birds, or if maybe weather impacts them. So, if we look at time again, this time we're looking at a longer time period, so from day 0 back 2 weeks, and we assign day 0 as the first day the female laid an egg. What we can do is look at what sort of weather events impacted whether or not females invested into her eggs or not. And the females can either invest in one of 2 ways. She can have large eggs, so she can devote a lot of energy into large but fewer eggs, or she can do smaller eggs but more eggs. So what I wanted to see was how rainfall impacts whether or not the females are investing or not into reproduction. And what I found was a little surprising. I found that females laid more eggs following more rainfall. So what that means is in that 2 weeks leading up to when that female first laid the egg, in those 2 weeks when the female is growing and developing those eggs, getting ready for them to be laid, if she experienced more rainfall, she was more likely to have more eggs. And this is surprising. We don't really fully understand what's happening here. There is some evidence that if the rainfall is pretty mild, there's more insect abundance following those short bits of rain, so she could have eaten more, have higher energy stores to devote into her eggs. But we don't really know what that means for severe weather events. So what if she just experienced a massive downpour? That's very energetically costly. Arguably, she would probably invest less in reproduction and more in survival. So we need to look into this a little bit more. I also hinted that we also looked at whether storms impact nest failure. So anytime that we found a nest, we would put this little button inside the nest. This is called an eye button, and what it does is it gives us temperature readings. The little button is put at the bottom of the nest, underneath the eggs and the nestlings, if it has nestlings. And then that it's kept there until the nestlings either die or until they leave the nest. And then we go in and retrieve that button, and we can look at what's happening temperature-wise within the nest. So if we look at a plot where over time we'll look at temperature, the red here just signals the ambient temperature. So this would be nighttime, the daytime, nighttime, daytime, and you'll see this typical pattern of the ambient temperature rising and falling with the sun. With an I button, we can look at how that compares to the ambient temperature. So if a female is incubating, that temperature should remain pretty constant. She does her best to keep her eggs and her nestlings at a very constant temperature so that they can develop properly and grow properly. So if we look at the I button, we'll see that for the most part it should stay pretty constant. It may dip a little bit if it's colder night, but if the nest fails or if suddenly all the fledglings or all the nestlings leave the nest, what we see is a massive drop in temperature. And then the temperature of the nest will start syncing up with the ambient temperature because the female and the nestlings are no longer there. So using these buttons, we can pinpoint the exact time that the nest either fails or if the nestlings leave the nest. And using this technology, I can then relate these failure or fledge points to what was happening in the days prior to it. And an undergraduate in Alice's lab previously worked on this project, but I'm taking it over now. But what we found is that 17% of the nests failed following a severe storm. And that's pretty big. So previously we thought the vast majority of the nests failed just due to predation. But there's actual evidence from this now that these birds actually may respond negatively to these severe flood events. These failures can either be flooding of the nest because it's a cup on the ground that water can fill up and the nest can drown, or it could be due to abandonment of the female. The storm was too severe, she couldn't survive by staying on her nest, or it could be due to low survival of the female. Maybe she actually perished during the severe weather event. All of those are encompassed within this 17% failing. So, I've just shown you evidence that these severe weather events can impact reproduction. Not only can it impact the nest success, but it also can impact how much energy a female devotes into her eggs. The next step of my postdoc is to figure out what this means for the population as a whole. Bringing you back to this diagram, we see that there's multiple ways that the population can grow through births and emigration, and multiple ways for the population to decline via deaths and immigration. So my next step is to figure out how this all varies with respect to storms. So that is still to be done. But overall today, we talked about how storms and rainfall are associated with scores of these birds, the overall condition of the birds. We've seen, I showed you evidence that tornadoes can lead to altered weather condition. Storms and the rainfall leading up to egg laying can impact clutch size, and we've seen that nests can fail following storms. So what does this mean for the grasshopper sparrows? And what does this mean specifically for the grasshopper sparrows of Kansas? Specifically because we're going to be seeing a lot of change in the climate within the next coming years within Kansas. So what we might see is with more severe storms, we might see elevated mortality of offspring, especially with a higher risk of floods. A decrease in the summer rainfall could lead to a differential amount of investment by the female into her eggs. We saw that more rainfall led to more eggs. So with less overall rainfall, we might see smaller and smaller clutches. Drier soil could lead to different vegetation structures, which impact whether or not the birds actually choose to migrate here. And the higher temperatures might end up causing the birds to not even be able to live here anymore. So, the work that I'm trying to do is essentially figure out or predict how these birds will respond to the future changing climate. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, and I'd like to thank all of the field technicians that worked on this project, my supervisor, Dr. Alice Boyle, and all the funding networks that allowed for this work to happen. And with that, thanks.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
Do you have a question?
But particularly, there seems to be a general loss of birds. To me, we live out in the country, and we haven't seen any grasshoppers this quite a while.
Oh, really?
And last summer, and we haven't gotten this summer yet. So last summer, I think that this sounds like we're in trouble quite a bit, and there's not really much we can do about it. You're thinking of something we can do?
There are things we can do. So we can manage the land a little differently. So from Kanza, we know that the grasshopper sparrows prefer land that was burned every 2 years. So that gives us a certain sort of foliage structure where the grass isn't too high, there's not too much forbs or flowering plants. But they really do not like any shrubs or trees at all. And recent work by one of Alice's PhD students found that they won't even be, like, it's very, very uncommon to find them within even like 500 meters of a tree. So what they really prefer is open swaths of 2-year-old grasses. So if we want to help preserve these birds, at least in the tall grass prairie, that's what we're going to need to, that's how we're going to have to manage that land. Make sure there's not a lot of taller trees, taller shrubs, and burn it every 2 years.
Are they omnivorous?
Yes. Yeah, so in the summer, they typically primarily eat insects. So they eat a lot of caterpillars and grasshoppers throughout the summer. In the winter, though, they shift their diet to what's available in Texas and Mexico, and that's primarily seeds. But they can mix.
Primarily what?
Seeds. Yes.
What is the average that you were trying to do in terms of frames between drawings? Is it 2 years, 3 years, 4 years?
That's a good question. To be honest, I don't know. I think it depends on what sort of land they have. If they have cattle, they typically burn it in the winter or the spring, which is great for grasshopper sparrows, but they typically do it on an annual basis. I don't know about other farms.
I was also wondering, you talked about fat deposition, and you said higher temperatures increase it. And as I recall, moisture levels, they will have with the oxygen.
Yes.
Is it possible that the factor with the valve is humidity? In other words, when it's raining, maybe you have no clouds, you have less heat.
That's a great question. So,
could you repeat that question?
Yes. This gentleman was wondering what impact humidity had on the fat deposition. So I only really talked about temperature and rainfall. But what I didn't tell you was my metric of temperature is what we call wet bulb temperature. And it is a combination of humidity and temperature to let us know what it actually feels like. So for example, if it's 80 degrees outside with 100% humidity, to us it feels like 100 degrees. So that's the temperature I actually end up using. So humidity is actually in that analysis.
Related question, how many clutches of eggs do they normally produce?
So these birds can have 2 to 3 attempts each year. So typically that means they can raise 2 full clutches a year with the chance of 1 failure. But they'll keep trying until they're successful, really, or until they run out of time and have to quit.
I was wondering, in your temperature, have you looked at the different clutches? I see no absolute temperature. So from the first clutch to the last clutch in the summer, you're working with very different temperatures.
Yes. Yeah, so in my analysis, I actually controlled for time of season. So we call that ordinal date, so the number of the day within the year. So by controlling for that, we were able to just look at the effective temperature rather than temperature changing over time.
To a certain extent, you're taking temperature to affect that.
Yeah.
How about the virility of a male? Does the male lose virility under some?
That's a great question. I have no idea.
These are measures.
Yeah, I really don't know what effect temperature has on how potent males are.
Do males have any effect on, do they do anything as far as rearing or feeding?
So they can help build the nest, but for the most part, once the female is on the nest, they don't really do anything until there's nestlings, and then they can come feed the nestlings with the mom. Within the analysis of female investment into her eggs, we also included metrics of male condition. So the hypothesis there is that if you have a high quality male, he might invest a bit more into the offspring as well. But we found no effect of the male. It was only female condition, where it was only females in higher condition that laid heavier eggs or more eggs. Yeah.
Another one. How much difference have you gotten between years in your relationship? You dated started in
2013, yes.
So what range?
So the grasslands here, Kansas, very, very dynamic in terms of weather. For example, I think it was 2017 or 2018 where there was a huge drought. And that really does play into what happens with these birds. So we see typically a die-off of birds following droughts. Also, it could just be because following a drought, there's a huge shift in the vegetation structure. So birds just might not even migrate back and decide to stay at this location. Something that I didn't talk about in this presentation is that these birds are extremely mobile. Alice probably hinted at it a couple of weeks ago, but these birds within a season will move kilometers upon kilometers, or miles, sorry,